Welcome everyone to Masechet Megillah. If you're new to Daf Yomi, so particular exciting welcome. It's a great Masechet to get started. You'll see already from the very first line of the Gemara here that there's no special order to the Gemara. You can start anytime, and the Gemara assumes that anything, if you feel like, well, I don't know anything, I'm just starting now. Well, the Gemara assumes that you know everything, even things that we haven't even learned yet. So you're no different than any of the rest of us, because you'll see that the Gemara immediately starts off and says, well, why are you saying this? Didn't we already say, which is really further on, we said, as if kind of you knew it before. So anyway, you'll learn right away that there's no particular order. Starting anytime is a great time to start. It's a fun Masechet. I don't want to get into too many introductory things, which is why we've invited Dr. Ayala Lipson to give shiurim on the introductions to the Masechet. So if you haven't listened, I strongly recommend. It should have been on the podcast feed yesterday, and it's on our website. Excellent introduction to Megillah. Also, Gita wrote a fabulous introduction in English also. So listen to the introduction. You'll get a perspective on the Masechet and read up on it from Gita. Basically, the very short of it is that Masechet Megillah talks about reading the Megillah. That's the beginning of the Masechet. A little bit, just a very little bit about the mitzvot of Purim. There's kind of some funny dapim in there. And then it's going to get into Kriyat Torah. Okay, and things about Torah reading, which seems a little bit unconnected. Obviously, there are some connections. Anyway, you can, right? I like the way Ayala had it. There's a few riddles about this Masechet, so you can listen to her Shiur and see that. Okay, in the meantime, we're going to get started right away and jump right in. Megillah nikret b'yud aleph, b'yud bet, b'yud gimel, b'yud dalet, b'tet vav. Okay, no, it's kind of like the way Kriyat Shema started in the beginning of Brachot. Matai korin et Shema. From when do we read Shema? As if it's obvious we read Shema. It seems obvious we read the Megillah, even though it never says anywhere in the Megillah that we read it. Oh, I just remembered that. I didn't do any of the dedications. Sorry, excitement of first day. So here goes. Our month of learning is sponsored by Jordana and Kalman Shore on behalf of their daughter, Daria Esther, who's completing Masechet Megillah in honor of her bat mitzvah this month. Daria attended the Hadran Siyum, and there is no doubt that her attendance inspired her to learn each chapter with a different family member and begin her journey into the world of Gemara learning. Mazal Tov. Today's daf is also sponsored by Jessica Shklar in behalf of her sister, Ruth Leah Kahan's birthday. Happy birthday to a Hadran stalwart. Yes, Ruth started with me way back in the beginning of the last cycle. Ruth Leah Kahan from her sister, Jessica, who loves sharing Daf Yomi with you from across the ocean. And today's daf is also sponsored by Sharon Russ and family in loving memory of her father, David ben Avraham and Naomi, on his 4th yahrzeit. May his memory be a blessing and his neshama have an aliyah. Okay, so now we get to Megillah Nikret. So the Megillah is read. It doesn't even say like Me'ematai Korin et Shema ba'aravim. From where do we read Shema? It says Nikret. It was read. I'm not going to get into that, but there are people who talk about what's this idea of Megillah Nikret. It is read as opposed to Me'ematai Korin. One big difference between Shema and Megillah is that everybody's obligated to say Shema themselves. Megillah, we often go to hear somebody else read for us, and that's why Nikret, it is read in the passive. Now it says it's read on Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, Tet Vav. So this is also very different from what it says in the Megillah. In the Megillah Esther, it says, okay, in the 9th chapter, it discusses when the Megillah is read, and it says, it actually doesn't discuss when the Megillah is read. I should actually clarify from the beginning. It doesn't say at all that you're supposed to read the Megillah, just like it doesn't say in the Torah you're supposed to read Shema. But it does say that you're supposed to celebrate those days, and it makes distinctions, which we're going to get into today, between different types of cities and which day they celebrate. And that's because in Shushan, the capital, the war was still going on Yud Dalet, whereas all the cities outside where the Jews were fighting as well, the fighting ended on Yud Gimel, and therefore on Yud Dalet, they already celebrated. So when Mordechai instituted for future generations, he said, we're going to split it by these 2 days. Okay, the Ramban asked a great question. Those who were with me in Ranan yesterday, we learned it more be'iyun, more in depth, but I'll tell you in a very brief nutshell, the Ramban asked a great question, which is, how could we have this holiday that half the people, or some people are celebrating one day, some people are celebrating another day? It seems very odd. We don't really do that kind of thing. The only time we have it is 2 days of Yantif, but that's something totally different. And that's really, we celebrate the same day, but some people celebrate an additional day just in case they have the wrong day. Here we have people celebrating one day, people celebrating another day. It's very strange. It's true what happened. The facts on the ground that year were different, but should have just said next year, let's make it all one day. So he gives a bit of a historical approach to how it kind of things went out. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but what he basically says, and he disagrees with the Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah on a very basic issue. The Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah says the main miracle was really in Shushan. And that's what we usually think of, because Shushan was where the main thing was going on. And the main battle was there. And therefore, they can't celebrate any earlier because that wasn't when the miracle happened. They celebrate then. But what happened was historically, he basically says because of that, he doesn't really answer the question of two separate days. He just points out, he was talking about something else. He says the main miracle was on the 15th. Comes the Ramban, he says, no, you're wrong. And we're going to see in a minute that it all depends whether you live in a walled city or not a walled city. He says, why this issue of walled city, not walled city? And what he says is the miracle of Purim wasn't just in Shushan. It was everywhere. Everywhere around the world, people were allowed to kill Jews on that day. And then the Jews had the rights to fight back. That was the whole thing. They weren't allowed to fight back originally. Once they overrode Haman, they couldn't get rid of the decree, but they were able to say, well, the Jews can fight back. All the Jews were in danger, especially the ones who didn't have walls around them to protect them. So they were in the most danger. And the real holiday is on the 14th. And they were the ones who the first year after, they said, we're celebrating this as a holiday. And you can see it on the verses, but the others didn't. And then came Mordechai and he said, well, we need to also include all these other, they need to celebrate it as well. But they didn't feel the need as much because it wasn't such a huge victory. And therefore, when he instituted that, he doesn't fully answer the question, but then when they instituted for them, so it was almost like there's two different holidays. One is celebrating the huge miracle that even if you weren't protected, you were able to protect yourselves. And then in addition, there was this miracle that happened in Shushan and they fought back, but almost like two different things that went on and they're celebrated in two different places. And it doesn't fully answer the question, but he does address all sorts of interesting things. And a basic machloket about is the main miracle on the 15th or the 14th, was it in Shushan or was it outside of Shushan where the main miracle happened? Okay, in any case, we'll move on and get started with our daf, which is Megillah Nikret, Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, Tef Vav. Lo pachot v'lo yoter. Someone told me last night, it sounds a little bit like they're already, okay, we're going to see a bunch of Purim Torah and jokes in this Masechet and funny stories, and different from stories in Ta'anit, a different type of stories, I would say. And already in the beginning, she said she finds this Mishnah already funny because it says you could read it on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th. It sounds like a ton of options. But then it says, lo pachot v'lo yoter, but no more and no less. Like almost, we give you all these options and then, oh, by the way, but don't go, it's very limited. So now we're going to have how we go through this, and I'm not going to share screen here, but you can look at it on the sheet where I'm going to I mapped out on charts, and that part I actually did in English, not the rest of it, but that part I did in English to see what days everybody does it, depending. I made little calendars, okay, for each year. If the 14th falls on this day, who does where? We're going to split it into three. There's Krachim HaMukafim Choma Miyimot Yoshua ben Nun. Those are any walled cities. And from when do we determine walled cities? From the time of Yoshua ben Nun, okay, from the time of we conquered the land of Israel. Now, the obvious is why not from the time of Achashverosh? We'll get to that later in the Gemara today, where they bring an opinion that actually says it is from the time of Achashverosh. Okay, the Yerushalmi, I'll already tell you that because it's not here in the Gemara. The Yerushalmi says it's because of the kavod of Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is respected. And when do we determine Eretz Yisrael? From the time of Yoshua ben Nun. So therefore, we're not going to have something happen in Shushan, more special or different, without including any cities that are like them from, in Israel as well. And also, by the way, it fits with the Ramban. If all the walled cities were protected, then their holiday is a different day, right? There's one holiday celebrating the unprotected and one holiday celebrating the more protected people. The question is really why from the time of Yoshua ben Nun or not, and that the Yerushalmi answers that way. We'll see the Bavli gives a different answer. Kfarim v'ayarot gedolot. Now we have two other categories. We have villages and we have big cities. Korim b'yudalid. Okay, so they all read on the 14th, but it depends. Ela shahakfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. But the villages can do it earlier if they want, to the day of they would come to the big city. At least that's what it seems. There's a lot of lack of clarity here about this. I'll already tell you. They do it on the day they would come to the big city anyway, like on a Monday, on a Thursday, something like that. So a lot of questions asked here. If they're coming there's actually a debate whether they actually just makdimim, they could do it earlier if they want. They don't have to go to the big city. Okay. Some people think they go to the big city, we'll see the answer in the Gemara is a little different than we usually think. Usually we think they don't know how to read the Megillah, so they go to the big city to read the Megillah. What's the problem? Well, the person who's reading the Megillah is a city person, and they're not obligated in Purim on that day. So how could they fulfill the obligation for someone who is obligated on that day? So that's a little bit of a question. Some people actually think that someone from the village reads. Then the question is, why are they going into the big city? Some people think they don't go to the big city. They're allowed to do it earlier. But when I say some people, I mean commentaries on the Gemara. There's all different kinds of interpretations here about this Mishnah. Who's reading to who, right? Who's reading, where, not to who we know. Who's reading? Where are they reading? Is it in the city or is it in the village? Okay, and what about the nighttime? If they really are going into the city, they're clearly not reading the Megillah at night in the city because people didn't travel at night. It's not like they all slept overnight there. The whole point was they were going anyway to the city that day, so they allow them to read the Megillah that day. Well, what about Megillah at night? The Ran says from here you see that Megillah at night wasn't such an important thing. That was a later development. That's a possibility. Anyway, I'm kind of raising possibilities here, not answering them, because in the Gemara in general, there are no clear-cut answers, so I'm kind of just throwing some different opinions out there. Okay, so now we're going to get to Ketzad. How does it work? So the Mishnah is going to be one of these Mishnayot, which goes through all the details and all the cases, and that's why I made you little calendars on the sheet. If it comes out on a Monday, now the days of the Shuk and the people went to courts on Mondays and Thursdays. So if it's Yom Shini, that's why Torah readings Monday, Thursday. Maybe this is another connection, by the way, to Torah reading. Why did we talk about Torah reading in this Masechet? It's also similar to the Monday, Thursday. Okay, they read on that day. By the way, one of the interesting things that Ayelet said in her Shiur was that Torah reading and Megillah reading were all from the same time period. Ezra was mitaken Torah readings on Mondays and Thursdays, and right. He instituted that, so they were all developed in the same time period of the time that the Megillah happened. Okay, so if it falls on Yud Daled, it falls on Monday. So Kfarim va'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. That is already the Yom HaKnisa. So they all read on the 14th. Umukafot choma lemachar. Walled cities read on the 15th. That already it says in the Megillah. So they read on the next day, on Tuesday. Chaliot b'shlishi. If it comes out on Tuesday, or b'revi'i, or on Wednesday, that's the 14th. Comes out on Tuesday or Wednesday. Kvarim makdimim liyom HaKnisa. So they either do the 13th or the 12th. They go back a day or 2 days. Va'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. And big cities read on the 14th because they have no reason to do it earlier. Umukafot choma lemachal. And walled cities do it the next day on the 15th because that's when they do it. You're going to see that the big cities and the walled cities always do it on the 14th or the 15th unless it's Shabbat. And then we're going to have a separate issue. So mainly it's the kfar, the village, that's going to change, which again, we'll see in the Gemara in a minute. What's the reason for that? Although again, it's not going to be so clear cut. If it falls out on Thursday, this is exactly the same as if it would fall out on Monday, because then it's already the Yom HaKnisa, the day they would come to the city. So they would read on Thursday, and Mukafot Choma, any walled city, would read Lemachar on Friday. Chaliot Erev Shabbat. What if the 14th is on Erev Shabbat? So Friday, they don't go to the city. So Kfarim Makdimim Liyom HaKnisa. They do it on Thursday, on Yud Gimel. Ayarot Gedolot Umukafot Choma Korim Bo Bayom. Now you have a problem. If you're in a Mukaf Choma, you have to read on Shabbat. Now we don't want to read on Shabbat because you're not allowed. This is Zera Derabba. We've seen this a bunch of times with Lulav and Shofar. We're worried that you're going to carry your Megillah in Reshut HaRabim. So you can't read it on Shabbat. So what do? You read it the day before. Because remember, we said Lo Pachov Lo Yoter. It's like The Price is Right. I don't know if you remember that show. I'm a little bit dating myself. But you can never go over, right? You try to guess the price. It was this game show. And if you went over, you went bust. So it's the same idea. We don't go past the 15th. So therefore, they read it one day earlier on Friday. Chaliot b'Shabbat. What if the 14th is on Shabbat? So Kfarim v'ayarot gedolot makdimim v'korim liyom HaKnisa. So both of them read on Thursday. Okay, already if you're moving it, so let's move them also to Thursday, so they don't read on Friday when they're busy getting ready for Shabbat. Umukafot choma lemachal. And now Tevav falls on Sunday, so that's totally fine. Chaliot achar Shabbat. I see somebody wrote, Dina, it was a good question. Why didn't Sunday come first, right? In our calendar, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Shabbat. Here, for whatever reason, they put Sunday at the very end. What if the 14th is on Sunday? Kfarim makdimim liyom HaKnisa. We finally get to when you read it on the 11th. That's the only case you read it on the 11th. The 11th is Thursday. Okay, that's what I charted out on all the calendars. You can check if you don't believe me. But the 11th is Thursday, right? You get to the 14th on Sunday, and then Ayarot Gdolot Korim Bo Bayom. Right, they read on Sunday if you're in a big city, because no reason to change the date. And Mukafot Chomal Machar, they'll read on Monday. So there you have all your different permutations. Megillah Nikret Biyud Aleph. So now we're going to start with that. The Gemara asks, Minalam, from where do we get this? Now you would think this is a great question to start, but the Gemara says, what kind of a question is this? And this is where I said the Gemara doesn't work in any sort of order. Order doesn't really matter. Minalan, they already explained on Daf Dalid. Now, even though we haven't gotten there, the assumption is this answer is an answer that was already brought up in the discussion, and it was already answered. So why are you even asking this question? So what's the answer given there? And it's a little surprising because, again, the answer we always think of is maybe they don't know how to read the Megillah, and therefore they want to go to the big city where there's someone who can read the Megillah for them. They live in a village. They're not as knowledgeable. That's usually what we think about. But here, there's a totally different answer given, and it's a little bit complicated because the Gemara actually changes this answer in Daf Daled, and we'll get to this answer and deal with it a little bit more in depth when we get to Daf Daled, but I'll mention a little bit now while we learn it. Chachamim הקיlu על הכפרים להיות מקדימים ליום הכניסה, כדי שיספקו מים ומזון לאחיהם שבכרכים. It's a very strange statement for many reasons. It says here that the rabbis, why were they able to read it earlier? Because the rabbis were lenient with them. Why were they lenient with them? In order to allow them to give water and food to the people in the city. This is a little strange, right? Nowadays, where do you have more water and food? In the city or in the village? In the city, usually. But in those days, the city wasn't like they had big supermarkets in the city and had everything you wanted. It was the opposite. The city didn't have necessarily, it wasn't by a river. It didn't have fields. The fields are always outside the city. Remember in Eruvin, we always talked about there's the city and then there's the fields outside the city. So the people in the villages are the ones that have the food and they have the water. And they would bring it to the big city. Now it gets a little tricky. Rashi here says something very complicated to understand. He says, what does it mean, kedei sheyisapku, so that they provide for this people? And what does that have to do with anything? So Rashi says, shiu pnuyim biyom purim. We want to let them read it earlier, which then maybe would support the reading that they read it in the village earlier. They do it on whatever earlier day in order to allow them on Purim to be free, to come to the city to provide them with food for their su'udah, for their meal. Very weird interpretation. And in fact, the Gemara rejects this and eventually explains it's not so that they could come on Purim and do it. It's because they provide food and sustenance in general to the people. The rabbis kind of said, oh, well, you do something good and important. We're going to give you a heter, like we're going to make life easier for you. And when you're coming to the city anyway, that will be the day that you read, but we don't need to have you come another day. We don't want to make you schlep twice because, let's put it this, you're good people, as a reward for the fact that you do this, we're going to allow you to do it earlier. That's kind of the assumption. Again, it's still quite difficult and different from what we normally think about when we think about why they're going early. We never really think about this opinion, even though it's right there in the Gemara, first thing. Okay, so now this is good why you learn Gemara, because you learn that there's other things out there and not just what we're taught in school. So now the Gemara basically is in the middle of a question. It's a question on a question. The question was, where do we get that you can read on Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel? To which the Gemara said, we know why we get that, because the Chachamim were lenient to them for however we're going to explain this. And we'll, like I said, we'll understand this maybe a little better when we get to Daf Daled and we learn the sugya there. But Anan Hachi Kamrinan, they say that wasn't our question. This is our question. Since the assumption is that Anshe Knesset Agdola, which is Mordechai and his people, instituted Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, which has to be the case. Why? We're going to explain that right now. Because if you thought simple reading of the Megillah basically says Yud Daled Tevav, the simple reading of the Megillah doesn't mention Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel. But if you were to assume, the simple reading, which is Mordechai instituted Yud Daled for the people in the unwalled cities, Tevav for the people in the walled cities, and that's it. Well, Atu Rabbanan va'akre takanta takinu anshe knesset agdola. The rabbis can't just come along and say, listen, it's great that you guys are giving water and food to the people in the cities, and therefore we're going to reward you and make your life easier. And you can read it on Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel. When Mordechai and his court instituted Yud Daled, how could we all of a sudden they can't come and say, oh, we're changing this. And how do we know they can't just do that? If one court institutes something, and the assumption there was that Mordechai and his court instituted this whole laws about Purim, another court can't come along and just override this, unless he's wiser and has more intelligence and more numbers. Okay, this is a whole interesting sugya. We'll get to more in Sanhedrin about what is chokhmah, what is minyan. There's a very long daf, so I don't want to start getting into that. But clearly, our courts later were not as great as the court of Mordechai, so they can't do that. And therefore, it's obvious that even in the time of the Megillah, when Mordechai instituted this with his court, he must have instituted Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel. If that's the case, here comes the question. Now we're finally getting to the question. Minalan heicha remiza. Where is it alluded to in the Megillah? We know it's not said explicitly, but there must be some sort of reference to it. For this, we're going to have two different answers. Amar Rav Shemen bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Shemen bar Abba says the name Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Ka lekayem. The pasuk says in Megillat Esther, lekayem et yemei Purim ha'ele bizmanehem, in their times. What is bizmanehem? Zmanim harbei tiknu lahem. That teaches you there were many times instituted, meaning there's a whole slew of days that one can do it. Now we're going to have to get to, well, if there's a whole slew of days, why lo pachot v'lo yoter, why exactly these days, etc. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Why are you saying zmanehem means 5 days? That bizmanehem means you should do Purim in their times. What are their times? The 14th and the 15th that were already mentioned in the Megillah. So that would be the way to say it. So they say, im ken lemakazman. The pasuk should have said zman, in its proper time. Why did it say my zmanehem? Why did it say it in plural, in their times? Zmanim tuva, to teach you there's many times. To which the Gemara says, no, you could still say their times, plural, means Yudale Tefav, the 14th and the 15th. Zmano shel zeh lo k'zmano shel zeh. You could say it's telling you that the people on the 14th do it in their time, and the people on the 15th do it in their time. And maybe that's why it says it in plural. If it just said bizman, it would sound like there's one day. So im ken lemakaz zmanam. Here comes the grammar. Should have said zmanam, time of theirs, which would mean 2. My zmanehem, which means times of theirs. There's a double language of plural. Shmat mina kulu. From here you learn, it's kind of like 2 and another 2, that would get you to 4. Okay. And we need 5, which is going to be the next question. Okay. But it's basically zmanim. Zmanehem is short for zmanim shelahem. Times of theirs. Times is 2. Theirs is another 2. That's how you get to 4. So now the Gemara is going to say, right? First they say, so then they say, emazmanim tuva. Maybe once you're saying it's plural, it could mean 12 days, 14 days. Where'd you get to only 5? Once it says manehem, right? I just said it means 4. That's already the next answer. But first they say manehem sounds like do it in any time you want. Obviously within a certain framework, maybe in Adar, something like that. It's actually quoted lahalach in the Shulchan Aruch that if you couldn't read the Megillah in time, you can actually read it the whole month of Adar. It's very interesting halacha. But anyway, now it says, well, zmanehem dumiyad dizmanam. Because zmanehem is like zmanam, we're going to use this word. It has zman in it. It has zmanam in it. It has zmanehem in it. Right? Time, their times, and their time and their times. Okay, so therefore they're going to say, ma zmanam trei, af zmanehem trei. This is what I said. Just like if it was zmanam, it would be 2. Zmanehem is double that. It's 4. So now we're at 4, which is not really good because we need 5. Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, Tefav. So the Gemara says, ve'ema tresar u'tleisar. So then you should really only say the 12th and the 13th. Now, this is one of these sugyas, and the Ritva is going to say it on the later sugya. We have a few of these sugyas today, which these questions aren't really realistic questions. It's just the rabbis use the methodology of raising unrealistic possibilities because they know it has to be Yud Dalet. Otherwise, what are you going to do when it comes out on a Sunday and you have to be makdim liyom haknisa? So of course it could be read on Yud Aleph. But the point is they raise all these questions in order to get it answers. Sometimes they don't really believe that this would be an option, but They're saying theoretically then it would only be 12th and the 13th. To which they say, we're going to bring in an answer that Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak says in another case, which is we're going to see in a few lines, and we're going to say that same answer could apply here as well. Ked'amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, as he said, Yugimel zman kila lakoli v'lo tzarich l'ribuye. Once you have the 14th and the 15th, and then you want to add something, you really only need to add the 11th and the 12th. The 13th is obvious that it's going to be added. Why? Because it's a day that everybody gets together, everybody congregates. Now, either because it's Tanit Esther, and therefore it's obvious if we're going to add that, that's a day people get together on Tanit Esther, or what it means is that it's a time that in that time they got together because they were fighting on that day. So obviously that day is going to be included. If you're including something, you don't even need a special drasha for it. So therefore, just like he said it somewhere else, Hachanami, we can apply his answer here as well and say, Yud Gimel Zman Kila Lakoli. V'lo tzarich l'ribuye, and it doesn't need any sort of thing. So Yud Gimel is obvious. The drasha adds on 11 and 12. Again, it's not the most convincing answer, but it's an answer. Ve'ema shitzar v'shivsar. What about the 16th and the 17th? Right. And that's if you're going to add two, why add before? Maybe add after. To which they said, by the way, yeah, I would just want to point out, theoretically, you could read on Tanit Esther, and this is further proof it's good. We're on a fast day today, right? The fast day that we're celebrating today, Asara B'Tevet, which also became kind of Yom HaKadosh HaKlali, a catch-all, which is similar because we saw already Shivasar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, where all these catch-all, all these events happened, right? As opposed to saying all these events happened in history, you know, that Asara B'Tevet seemed to commemorate things that happened after Asara B'Tevet was declared to be the day, and we've kind of found all the, you know, things to connect to it. Anyway, Asara B'Tevet is a fast where we're sad. Tanit Esther, and this is maybe proof to this theory, that Tanit Esther is not a sad fast. Okay, and we saw this also in Ta'anit. We saw it in Ta'anit when we talked about Megillah Ta'anit and the days where you can't eulogize, and one of them is the 13th of Adar. It can't be a sad day. So it's not exactly a sad day. So it makes sense that one could read the Megillah on the 13th. Even though we normally associate fast days with sad days, it's not exactly. So now the Gemara says, what about the 16th and the 17th? V'lo ya'avor k'tiv. Okay, it says in the Pasuk, in the Megillah, it says, do celebrate these days, kayamim asher nachu b'hem ha'Yehudim, like the days, is that I'm reading the wrong Pasuk, sorry. Here. In Esther Perek Tet Pasuk Kaf Zayin. Kimu v'kiblu ha'Yehudim alehem, they accepted it upon themselves. And many people say they accepted the Torah again. I won't get into that right now. V'lo ya'avor liot osim et shnei yamim ha'elu, and they will not pass. Now it really means they won't not do them, but lo ya'avor means they won't pass the date. Okay, that's how the drasha goes. That's how we know it's the sixth. It's not the 16th and the 17th. That's the first answer. Zman nehem comes to add 2 additional days and plus the 13th, which you don't need a drasha for. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar, second answer, Amar kayamim asher nachu b'hem ha'Yehudim. They celebrated these days like the days where the Jews rested, meaning where they were saved. So yamim kayamim. Kayamim means in the future they instituted these days like those days. So what days like what days? Oh, the 2 days like the 2 days that already existed. This means they instituted again. We get back to the 4 days, and this is where Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani said what he said. So then they say kayamim asher nachu l'rabot yud aleph yud bet. That comes to say 2 more days instead of zmanehem. They learn it from kayamim. Ve'em atreisar v'tleisar. Maybe you should say then 2 days would be the 12th and the 13th. Here comes our answer from before, and the rest of the sugya reads the exact same way as before. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak. You don't need a drasha for it. To which the Gemara then asks again, what about shitzar, ema shitzar, shivsar? Why do you say the 16th and the 17th? V'lo ya'avor. It says v'lo ya'avor, therefore it's obvious. So we have either zmanam zmanehem, or we have kayamim. Okay, each one includes another 2 days, and we don't even need the 3rd day. That's obvious. Now we're going to ask the obvious Gemara type question, which is, why didn't he say his answer? Why didn't he say his answer? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, my time lo amar bizmanehem. Simply, zman zmanam zmanehem lo mashmale. He didn't think that was a good enough drasha. Didn't believe in it. Next, Rav Shimon bar Abba, my time lo amar kayamim. Amar lacha ule dorotu dichtiv. So they instituted these like the days. Now, like the days we understood as 2 extra days, like the days that they're celebrating, right? Yud Daled and Tefah. But really, the simple reading is, they instituted them now in a future year. We don't even know which year. Was it a year later, 2 years, 3 years later? We don't really know. But in a future date, they said, we're going to celebrate these days forever, like the days that were in the time when the miracle happened. So that's what Kayamim is, he thinks, and it doesn't have anything to do with the dates, and that's why he has a different answer. Until now, this was all assuming. You can read the Megillah on the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Now we're going to learn there was an opinion that you don't do this. This is the simple Rabbi Akiva's opinion. But but the rabbis disagree with this whole thing and say, no, you read the Megillah in its proper time. So the Gemara is going to ask a question on that. Wait a minute. Meitive, there's a source that says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Matai. When do we do Yud Aleph Yud Bet Yud Gimel? Those dates. Bizman Shashanim Ketikna B'Yisrael Shruyin Alad Matam. In the years when the years go the way they normally do, which really means in the time of the temple. But when the Jews are no longer in their land and there's no temple, they look to the date of Purim to determine the date for Pesach. So if we read it on the 12th, people are going to think that the 12th of Nisan is Pesach. Everybody knows there's exactly a month. So since this date is needed to determine when Pesach is, nowadays you only read it in its proper time. Now, why is this a question to what they claim Rabbi Yochanan said, that the Chachamim actually think that you can't read it on these days? Because Rabbi Yehuda aliba deman, according to who does he go? He either has to hold like Rabbi Akiva or he has to hold like the rabbis. According to Rabbi Akiva lived, he actually lived during the Churban, but he also lived after the Churban. And if he says that we do it on Yud Aleph Yud Bet Yud Gimel, he must have been talking about post-destruction, which would mean that we still say it because we could still read it on Yud Aleph Yud Gimel. Otherwise, he would have specified that. So it can't be Rabbi Akiva. And what does it say? Well, the rabbi said there is no such thing as Yud Aleph Yud Gimel Yud Aleph. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? In the time of the temple, there was. So therefore, if the temple is around and the Jews are in their land, then you would read Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan. You could read then on Yud Aleph Yud Bet Yud Gimel. So this doesn't match anybody's opinion, and therefore Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. This is a question against this reading of Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're going to have a different reading of Rabbi Yochanan. Some people say that what he said was a little bit different. Okay, still our mission is like Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim, according to Rabbi Yochanan, say nowadays there's no Yud Aleph Yud Bet Yud Gimel, just like Rabbi Yehuda did. And in fact, now we can bring Rabbi Yehuda to prove the Chachamim and say Rabbi Yehuda is exactly Chachamim, which is there was a time when it was read on Yud Aleph Yud Bet Yud Gimel, but it's no longer anymore. Tanya Nami Hachi. So here's the Braita to support. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so now you have it that nowadays we don't do it anymore according to the rabbis. And that goes against our Mishnah, because the Mishnah didn't say this is only in the time of the temple. Rav Ashi, now we're going to have a topic sentence. We're kind of going to get the whole beginning, middle, and end of the next sugya without actually understanding any of the content. But Rav Ashi Kashalei de Rabbi Yehuda brought a contradiction of Rabbi Yehuda from something else Rabbi Yehuda said. Umokim le Braita Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, and then said there's a mistake in the Braita. And it wasn't Rabbi Yehuda who said the Braita that we just quoted before, that it all depends on when this happened, whether it's post-destruction, before destruction. But that was all said by Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda, because of this contradiction. So now what's the contradiction? Here goes. Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that nowadays, when there's no temple anymore, we have to read it in its appropriate time? Urimini, that contradicts the following source. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Matai, when can we go to the main city? Makom shenichnesim b'sheni u'v'chamishi. It has to be a place, like let's say nowadays I'm living in a village, and we don't have this thing anymore that on Mondays and Thursdays people go to the big city. So if I live in a place where everybody goes to the big city on Mondays, Thursdays, then I can do it earlier and do it on one of those days. But that's makom shenichnesim b'sheni u'v'chamishi. Aval makom she'ein nichnesim b'sheni u'v'chamishi. But if there is no shuk day or court day or things where everybody goes to the big city, Then this whole thing, this whole point is moot. Now, what do you see from here? How does this contradict what Rabbi Yehuda said? Because this is obviously talking about nowadays, once there's a destruction. And it does imply that there are people who could do it earlier, as long as there is a day where everybody goes to the big city, then you can read it earlier. So if that's right, even nowadays, in which case that contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda said, that it's no longer applicable, this halacha. So therefore, Mokim la Braita Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. So therefore, Rav Ashi said, now I want to remind you who Rav Ashi is. Rabbi Yehuda was toward the end of the time period of the Tanaim. He's not Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He's Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli. Okay, he's the Stam Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. He and in the Braita, he basically said, right? So Rabbi Yehuda says one thing. Comes Rav Ashi at the very end of the Amoraim time period, around the year 500, he put together the Gemara, he edited it, and he comes and says, well, that Braita people are quoting, Braita means something outside, right? It was something that from the time of the Mishnah that didn't make it into the Mishnah, that people recited by heart. Because they recited them by heart, often there were mistakes. He said, oh, it must be, it's not Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Where you could see someone would get confused, some words got lost there, confused it, thought it was Rabbi Yehuda. So now the Gemara asks the question that probably, especially if you're new to Gemara, you might think to ask this question. Umishum de kashele de Rabbi Yehuda, mokim la lebraitek Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Comes Rav Ashi, he says, contradiction in Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, change it. Doesn't say Yehuda. It says Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Let's add 2 words and resolve the issue like that. What, you could just do that? It's okay. Just, okay, out of the blue, just assume it must be Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda instead of Rabbi Yehuda. So they say, no, there's more to it than that. It's not like he just pulled it out of a hat and, randomly said, it must be Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. This is what happened. Rav Ashi Shmiale, he heard, De'ika detanele ke Rabbi Yehuda, De'ika detanele ke Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Time of the Amoraim, there were people who repeated Braita. They were known to just memorize. People have good memories. They would memorize them and they bring them to the Beit Midrash. So some people he heard had the version of the Braita that said Rabbi Yehuda, but other people said Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. So when he figured out there was this contradiction, he said it must be that those who were saying Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda must be right. So it's not that he just made it up. No, he had basis for it. So midakashele, and here they're going to explain it inside what I just explained. Since he had a difficulty of Rabbi Yehuda to Rabbi Yehuda, Amal, he said, Man detani like Rabbi Yehuda, lav dafka. The one who said it like Rabbi Yehuda was not careful in their memorization. And Man detani like Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, dafka. And the one who did was careful, and therefore he basically preferred one over the other. That was really an aside to us. Reading the Gemara, it doesn't seem so important to us whether Rabbi Yehuda said it, Rabbi Yehuda said it, but obviously to them it was important to associate things with people, especially if something contradicted, because otherwise you could say contradiction, maybe all those sources are wrong or one of them is wrong. Once you fix it, say it's someone else, then it all can make sense. Moving on, we have 2 more sugyot to deal with. Now we want to get to, where did they get to the fact that all walled cities do it on the 15th? Because theoretically in the Megillah, it talks about Shushan did it on the 15th. So how do we get to all walled cities? Where do we get it from? So Amarava Damalka, the pasuk says, Al Ken HaYudim HaPrazim HaYoshvim Ba'arei HaPrazot. This seems to be in the Ramban's explanation that I mentioned, that we learned yesterday in Ranana, which is the Yudim that sat in the Arei HaPrazot on the first year. The first thing that happened was the people started. It wasn't that Mordechai came along and instituted this holiday forever. First, the people in the unwalled cities, according to the Rabban, who had the most danger, were the most vulnerable, they on their own made this celebration on the 14th. Now, midaprazim ba'arba'asa. Now, notice what it says. The people in the unwalled cities. So that would imply walled cities didn't do it on that day. And then when Mordechai sets it forever, right, there's walled cities and not walled cities. That would be the differentiation. So midaprazim ba'arba'asa, mukafim must be b'chamisha. So now again, they're going to ask all these random questions, which again are just trying to get to the point. I don't think they really thought these were questions. Ve'ema prazim, again, I'm basing this on the Ritva who says this. I didn't make that up. Ve'ema prazim ba'arba'asar mukafim klal klal lo. Maybe just the people in the unwalled cities who were so vulnerable, they should make the celebration. And the people in the walled cities, maybe they shouldn't need to make a celebration. The truth is, with the Ramban, this is a reasonable question because they weren't really in danger. Maybe in Shushan they were, but every other walled city in the world was not as much in danger. And therefore, maybe they shouldn't even celebrate. So the Gemara answers, the Lav Yisrael, what are they, not Jews? Ve'od mehod v'yad kush k'tiv. It said all the cities and all of the Medina. Now, it doesn't say they fought against them. Hod v'yad kush comes up only in the first pasuk of the Megillah. But at the end of the Megillah, it talks about how they fought against all the Jews. And it seems to include, it said b'chol Medina, Medina. It seems to include all these different places. So it would include any other place as well. Ve'ema, second question. Prazim ba'arba sal, mukafim ba'arba sal, uvechamesh sal. Someone said this before in the chat. Why didn't they just do it 2 days? Maybe you say, people in the unwalled cities do it on the 14th, because that's what happened. They started doing it on the 14th. They started celebrating. Okay, but walled cities maybe should do it also on the 14th and also on the 15th, which again, according to the Ramban, the 14th is the main miracle. This would make a lot of sense. According to the Rambam, a little more difficult. The 15th is the main miracle. It should be the reverse. The people in the unwalled cities should do it both days. But anyway, this seems to support the Ramban. They should do it on the 14th and the 15th. Again, we're quoting from the Megillah at the end there. It says you should do it on the 14th and the 15th every year. So maybe it means do it on both days. So they say no. It said do it on the 14th and the 15th. I would agree with you. That little word, and, right, et, which is a word you can't really translate. Yom ha'chamisha asar, ata et upasik. It splits to mean there's one to do it on the 14th, hani b'arba asar, and hani b'chamisha asar, and one to do it on the 15th. So then they say, okay, so if assuming some do it on the 14th, some do it on the 15th, here's another suggestion. Ve'ema prazim ba'arba sal, mukafin ibao b'arba asar, ibao b'chamesh sal. Maybe they could choose which day they want to do it on, the walled cities. Amar kra bizmanehem. So they can't do that because it says in its time. That's the pasuk we started with. Zmano shalzeh, lo zmano shalzeh. Each place has its own particular time. Could you imagine? It's bad enough. Some cities do it this way, some cities do it that way. If people within the city, everyone's doing something different, that would be really strange. We already have that, right? Depending on where you sleep at night, but I'm not going to get into all that yet. Ve'ema b'tleisa. They suggest, well, if we have Shushan, they do it on the 15th, and the unwalled cities do it on the 14th. Maybe the walled cities should do it on the 13th that aren't Shushan. It's a little bit of a strange theory, but okay. So they say, no, kish Shushan. They do it like Shushan, which is obvious answer. We understand that there's this distinction when it comes to doing them. The pasuk never said read the Megillah. The pasuk said, make this day a day of Yom Tov, do Mishloach Manot, Matanot Levyonim. But what about Zechira? What about mentioning, meaning the Megillah, which is in words, verbal? Amar kra v'hayamim ha'ele nizkarim v'na'asim. Itris Zechira l'asiyah. Zechira is mentioned next to Asiyah in the pasuk. So therefore, whatever is true for Asiyah is going to be true for Zechira, and therefore the reading of the Megillah will be on the same day that you do the mishteh, the matanot levyonim, all that. Now the last sugya is matnitin deloki haitan. Wait a minute. Our Mishnah does not go like another. We already had Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel isn't everybody's opinion. Also, this walled from the time of Yoshua is not the only opinion. So yes, it's true, except for Per Mishulash. I didn't want to get into that, but anyway, we'll get back to that. Titania, Rabbi Yoshua ben Kor Chomer, Chachim amukafim choma miyimot ha'chashverosh korim b'chamisha asar. Here you have a different opinion. It's from the time of Achashverosh, not from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. My time of Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. What's his reason? Ki Shushan, just like Shushan. It's actually the most logical. Right? Shushan didn't have a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, or we don't know it did anyway. Had a wall from the time of Achashverosh, so that should be the one to determine. So now what about our Tana? What does he hold? Tana didam my time. What's his reason? Yalif prazi prazi. K'tiv hacha al kena yudima prazim, which means those who live in unwalled cities. Uktiv hatam, and it says it in a pasuk in Dvarim. Levad me'area prazi harbe ma'od. And there it's talking about walled cities when they get into the land of Israel, which goes from the time of Yoshua, unwalled cities, when it goes to the time of Yoshua ben Nun. So, again, I told you in the Yerushalmi, they give a different reason. Here they have a Gzera Shav. Okay, that's how we learned. So Bishlama Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha lo amar katana didam. We could have an easy explanation why Yoshua ben Korcha didn't hold this way. Because we have rules with Gzera Shavas only if you learned it from your rabbi. So you could just say, must be, late praze praze. He never learned that Gzera Shava. He didn't have a tradition about it. He didn't buy into it. But Elatana didam, my time alo amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. It's actually very logical to make it like Shushan from the time of Achashverosh, my time. So now they say, what do you mean, my time? Eat le praze praze, as a Gzera Shava. What do you mean? What's his reason? His reason is obvious why he doesn't know by him. So they say, well, hachi kamar. This is what we meant to say. Ela Shushan da avda kiman. According to Tanakama, we have a problem. Tanakama, or the Tan of our Mishnah, he says the walled cities go by the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Now, Shushan didn't have a wall in the time of Yoshua ben Nun. So when would Shushan do it according to them? Lo kiprazim v'lo kimukafim. Doesn't fit into any category. So Amar Rava, Amar Lakti, some people say Rava said, some people say it was just said. Shane Shushan o Ilvanas Habanis. Shushan's an exception. You don't need a special. That's where the miracle happened. Obviously, you do it on the 15th, even though it doesn't fall into either category, walled or unwalled, because right, wasn't walled from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Bishlama, now they're going to raise a question on Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, then they're going to raise a question on Tana of our Mishnah, and that's where we'll end today. Bishlama l'Tana didan hainu dichtim medina u'medina v'ir v'ir. Right, it says this should be done in all the countries and in all the states and in all the cities. Why? Medina is to say l'chalek be'mukafim chamamim el Yoshua ben Nun, l'mukaf chamamim el Achashverosh. Right, it's to say Medina, whether it was walled in the time of Yoshua or not. The ir is to add l'chalek ben Shushan l'sharaya wrote. The assumption is if it says it twice, it means there's some Medina like this, some Medina like that. And then within that, there's some cities like this, some cities like that, because Shushan didn't fall into any category. We need another pasuk to tell us that. El Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha b'shlama Medina l'chalek ben Shushan l'sharaya wrote. According to Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, Shushan already gets separated at the Medina stage because it's walled from the time of Achashverosh or not walled. So what do you need? Ir va'ir, el ir va'ir l'may ata. To which Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha throws the question back on the original opinion. Amar lacha Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, is he could say, he didn't say this, but those supporting his answer said, Ulitana didam minicha. Even to our Tana, it doesn't make sense. Kevadile praze medina lately. Lamali, you don't need medina once you say praze gzera shava. It's obvious then there's this separation. You don't need another pasuk to tell you. Therefore, medina doesn't think what you meant, which meant you asked a question on me from it. But the pasuk is coming for a different drasha. Could Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi hudata? The way Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, the Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, totally different halachas than for Medina and ir va'ir. Krach v'chol samuchlo v'chol nir'elo nirei mo nidon kikrach. A walled city is not just the walled city, but anything that's near it and anything that can see it. If you can see the city from there, and this is what we do nowadays, cities on the outskirts of Jerusalem also do like the 15th. Ad kama, classic Gemara question. So how far? Well, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'yitem Rabbi Farber Abba kimechamatan l'Tveria. I like the distance of Chamatat Tveria, which is a mile, which is similar to a mile. V'leim a mile. The Gemara says, why do you say from Chamatan to Tveria mil? Just say mil. Be much easier. Hakamashman, the Shiur the mil kama have kimechamatan l'Tveria. Let's teach you something additional. That how, in case you didn't know how long a mil is. It's from Chamatan Tveria. That might not help us. We do better with measurements. In those days, they did better with knowing from what city to what city. Oh, now I know what the distance is. And which we're going to finish with that because we quoted this answer of Rabbi Yirmiyah and maybe Rabbi Chia said it. The Gemara is now going to go into something else that he said, seemingly unconnected, and we'll start with that tomorrow. So I hope you enjoy the beginning of Masechet Megillah, and we will end here for today.